My arms are crossed under my neck, and I'm looking into this Arabian night which curves over me, black and starry. A shooting star flies in a tremendous arc, and there another, and yet another. Arcs of light piercing the darkness. Are they only bits of broken-up planets, fragments of some cosmic disaster now aimlessly flying through the vastness of the universe? Oh no, if you ask Zaid, he will tell you that these are the fiery javelins with which angels drive away the devils, that on certain nights stealthily ascend toward heaven to spy upon God's secrets. Was it perhaps Iblis himself, the king of all devils, who has just received that mighty throw of flame there in the east? The legends connected with the sky and its stars are more familiar to me than the home of my childhood. How could it be otherwise? Ever since I came to Arabia, I have lived like an Arab, worn only Arab dress, spoken only Arabic, dreamed my dreams in Arabic. Arabian customs and imageries have almost imperceptibly shaped my thoughts. I have not been hampered by the many mental reservations which usually make it impossible for a foreigner, be he ever so well versed in the manners and the language of the country, to find a true approach to the feelings of its people and to make their world his own. And suddenly I have to laugh aloud with the laughter of happiness and freedom, so loud that Zaid looks up in astonishment, and my dromedary turns its head toward me with a slow, faintly supercilious movement. For now I see how simple and straight, in spite of all its length, my road has been. My road from a world which I did not possess to a world truly my own. My coming to this land, was it not, in truth, a homecoming? Homecoming of the heart that has espied its old home backward over a curve of thousands of years, and now recognizes this sky, my sky, with painful rejoicing. For this Arabian sky, so much darker, higher, more festive with its stars than any other sky, vaulted over the long trek of my ancestors, those wandering herdsmen warriors, when, thousands of years ago, they set out in the power of their morning, obsessed by greed for land and booty, toward the fertile country of Chaldea and an unknown future, that small Bedouin tribe of Hebrews, forefathers of that man who was to be born in Ur of the Chaldees. That man, Abraham, did not really belong in Ur. His was but one among many Arab tribes which at one time or another had wound their way from the hungry deserts of the peninsula toward the northern dreamlands that were said to be flowing with milk and honey, the settled lands of the Fertile Crescent, Syria and Mesopotamia. Sometimes such tribes succeeded in overcoming the settlers they found there and established themselves as rulers in their place, gradually intermingling with the vanquished people and evolving together with them into a new nation, like the Assyrians and Babylonians, who erected their kingdoms on the ruins of the earlier Sumerian civilization, or the Chaldeans, who grew to power in Babylon, or the Amorites, who later came to be known as Canaanites in Palestine, and as Phoenicians on the coasts of Syria. At other times the oncoming nomads were too weak to vanquish those who had arrived earlier and were absorbed by them, or alternatively the settlers pushed the nomads back into the desert, forcing them to find other pastures and perhaps other lands to conquer. The clan of Abraham, whose original name, according to the book of Genesis, was Abraham, which in ancient Arabic means he of the high desire, was evidently one of those weaker tribes. The biblical story of their sojourn at Ur on the fringe of the desert relates to the time when they found that they could not win for themselves new homes in the land of the twin rivers, and were about to move northwest along the Euphrates towards Haran and thence to Syria. He of the high desire, that early ancestor of mine, whom God had driven toward unknown spaces, and so to discovery of his own self, would have well understood why I'm here, for he also had to wander through many lands before he could build his life into something that you might grasp with your hands, and had to be guessed at many strange hearths before he was allowed to strike root. To his awe-commanding experience, my puny perplexity would have been no riddle. He would have known, as I know it now, that the meaning of all my wanderings lay in a hidden desire to meet myself, by meeting a world whose approach to the innermost questions of life, to reality itself, was different from all I had been accustomed to in my childhood and youth. What a long way, from my childhood and youth in Central Europe to my present in Arabia, but what a pleasant way for remembrance to travel backward. There were those early childhood years in the Polish city of Lwów, then in Austrian possession, in a house that was as quiet and dignified as the street on which it stood, a long street of somewhat dusty elegance, bordered with chestnut trees and paved with wood blocks that muffled the beat of the horses' hoofs, and converted every hour of the day into a lazy afternoon. I loved that lovely street with the consciousness far beyond my childish years, and not merely because it was the street of my home. I loved it, I think, because of the air of noble self-possession with which it flowed from the gay center of that gayest of cities toward the stillness of the woods on the city's margin, and the great cemetery that lay hidden in those woods. Beautiful carriages would sometimes fly past on silent wheels to the accompaniment of the brisk, rhythmic trap of prancing hooves. Or, if it happened to be winter and the street was blanketed with foot-deep snow, sledges would glide over it, and steam would come in clouds from the horses' nostrils, and their bells would tinkle through the frosty air. And if you yourself sat in the sledge and felt the frost rush by and bite your cheeks, your childish heart knew that the galloping horses were carrying you into a happiness that had neither beginning nor end. And there were the summer months in the country where my mother's father, a wealthy banker, maintained a large estate for his large family's pleasure. A sluggish little stream with willow trees along its banks, barns full of placid cows, mysteriously pregnant with the scent of animals and hay, and the laughter of the Ruthenian peasant girls who were busy in the evenings with milking. You would drink the foaming warm milk straight from the pails, not because you were thirsty, but because it was exciting to drink something that was still so close to its animal source. Those hot August days spent in the fields with the farm hands who were cutting the wheat, and with the women who gathered and bound it in sheaves. Young women, good to look at, heavy of body, full of breast, with hard, warm arms, the strength of which you could feel when they rolled you over playfully at noontime among the wheat stacks. But, of course, you were much too young then to draw further conclusions from those laughing embraces. And there were journeys with my parents to Vienna and Berlin and the Alps and the Bohemian forests and the North Sea and the Baltic, places so distant that they almost seemed to be new worlds. Every time one set out on such a journey, the first whistle of the train engine and the first jolt of the wheels made one's heart stop beating in anticipation of the wonders that were now to unfold themselves. And there were playmates, boys and girls, a brother and a sister and many cousins, and glorious Sundays of freedom after the dullness, but not too oppressive a dullness, of weekdays in school, hikes through the countryside, and the first surreptitious meetings with lovely girls of one's own age, and the blush of a strange excitement from which one recovered only after hours and hours. It was a happy childhood, satisfying even in retrospect. My parents lived in comfortable circumstances, and they lived mostly for their children. My mother's placidity and unruffled quiet may have had something to do with the ease with which in later years I was able to adapt myself to unfamiliar and, on occasion, most adverse conditions, while my father's inner restlessness is probably mirrored in my own. If I had to describe my father, I would say that this lovely, slim, middle-sized man of dark complexion and dark, passionate eyes was not quite in tune with his surroundings. In his early youth he had dreamed of devoting himself to science, especially physics, but had never been able to realize this dream and had to content himself with being a barrister. Although quite successful in this profession, in which his keen mind must have found a welcome challenge, he never reconciled himself to it fully, and the air of loneliness that surrounded him may have been caused by an ever-present awareness that his true calling had eluded him. His father had been an Orthodox rabbi in Czernowitz, capital of the then Austrian province of Bukovina. I still remember him as a graceful old man, with very delicate hands and a sensitive face framed in a long white beard. Side by side with his deep interest in mathematics and astronomy, which he studied in his spare time throughout his life, he was one of the best chess players of the district. This was probably the basis of his long-standing friendship with the Greek Orthodox archbishop, himself a chess player of note. The two would spend many an evening together over the chessboard, and would round off their sessions by discussing the metaphysical propositions of their respective religions. One might have presumed that, with such a bent of mind, my grandfather would have welcomed his son's my father's inclination toward science. But apparently he had made up his mind from the very first that his eldest son would continue the rabbinical tradition which went back in the family for several generations, and refused even to consider any other career for my father. In this resolve he may have been strengthened by a disreputable skeleton in the family cupboard, the memory of an uncle of his, that is, a great-great-uncle of mine, who had in the most unusual way betrayed the family tradition, and even turned away from the religion of his forefathers. That almost mythical great-great-uncle, whose name was never mentioned aloud, seems to have been brought up in the same strict family tradition. At a very young age he had become a full-fledged rabbi, and been married off to a woman whom he apparently did not love. As the rabbinical profession did not bring sufficient remuneration in those days, he supplemented his income by trading in furs, which every year necessitated a journey to Europe's central fur market, Leipzig. One day, when he was about 25 years old, he set out by horse cart. It was in the first half of the 19th century, on one of these long journeys. In Leipzig he sold his furs as usual, but instead of returning to his hometown, as usual, he sold the cart and the horse as well, shaved off his beard and side-locks, and forgetting his unloved wife, went to England. For a time he earned his living by menial work, studying astronomy and mathematics in the evening. Some patron seems to have recognized his mental gifts, and emerged after a few years as a promising scholar and a convert to Christianity. Shortly after sending a letter of divorce to his Jewish wife, he married a girl from among the Gentiles. Not much was known to our family about his later life, except that he achieved considerable distinction as an astronomer and university teacher, and ended his days as a knight. This horrifying example seems to have persuaded my grandfather to take a very stern attitude regarding my father's inclination toward the study of Gentile sciences. He had to become a rabbi, and that was that. My father, however, was not prepared to give in so easily. While he studied the Talmud in daytime, he spent part of his nights in studying secretly, without the help of a teacher, the curriculum of a humanistic gymnasium. In time he confided in his mother. Although her son's surreptitious studies may have burdened her conscience, her generous nature made her realize that it would be cruel to deprive him of a chance to follow his heart's desire. At the age of 22, after completing the 8 years' course of a gymnasium within 4 years, my father presented himself for the baccalaureate examination and passed it with distinction. With a diploma in hand, he and his mother now dared to break the terrible news to my grandfather. I can imagine the dramatic scene that ensued. But the upshot of it was that my grandfather ultimately relented and agreed that my father should give up his rabbinical studies and attend the university instead. The financial circumstances of the family did not, however, allow him to go in for his beloved study of physics. He had to turn to a more lucrative profession, that of law, and in time became a barrister. Some years later he settled in the city of Luau in eastern Galicia, and married my mother, one of the 4 daughters of a rich local banker. There, in the summer of 1900, I was born as the second of 3 children. My father's frustrated desire expressed itself in his wide reading on scientific subjects, and perhaps also in his peculiar, though extremely reserved, predilection for his second son. Myself, who also seemed to be more interested in things not immediately connected with the making of money and a successful career. Nevertheless, his hopes to make a scientist of me were destined to remain unfulfilled. Although not stupid, I was a very indifferent student. Mathematics and natural sciences were particularly boring to me. I found infinitely more pleasure in reading the stirring historical romances of Sainte-Creux, the fantasies of Jules Verne, read Indian stories by James Fenimore Cooper and Karl May, and later the verses of Rilke and the sonorous cadences of Also Sprach Zarathustra. The mysteries of gravity and electricity, no less than Latin and Greek grammar, left me entirely cold, with the result that I always got my promotions only by the skin of my teeth. This must have been a keen disappointment to my father, but he may have found some consolation in the fact that my teachers seemed to be very satisfied with my inclination toward literature, both Polish and German, as well as history. In accordance with our family's tradition, I received, through private tutors at home, a thorough grounding in Hebrew religious lore. This was not due to any pronounced religiosity in my parents. They belonged to a generation which, while paying lip service to one or another of the religious faiths that had shaped the lives of its ancestors, never made the slightest endeavor to conform its practical life or even its ethical thought to those teachings. In such a society, the very concept of religion had been degraded to one of two things: the wooden ritual of those who clung by habit, and only by habit, to the religious heritage, or the cynical insouciance of the more liberal ones, who considered religion as an outmoded superstition to which one might, on occasion, outwardly conform, but of which one was secretly ashamed, as of something intellectually indefensible. To all appearances, my own parents belonged to the former category, but at times I have a faint suspicion that my father, at least, inclined toward the latter. Nevertheless, in deference to both his father and his father-in-law, he insisted on my spending long hours over the sacred scriptures. Thus, by the age of 13, I not only could read Hebrew with great fluency, but also spoke it freely, and had in addition a fair acquaintance with Aramaic, which may possibly account for the ease with which I picked up Arabic in later years. I studied the Old Testament in the original, the Mishnah and Gemara. That is, the text and commentaries of the Talmud became familiar to me. I could discuss with a good deal of self-assurance the differences between the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, and I immersed myself in the intricacies of biblical exegesis, called Targum, just as if I had been destined for a rabbinical career. In spite of all this budding religious wisdom, or maybe because of it, I soon developed a supercilious feeling toward many of the premises of Jewish faith. To be sure, I did not disagree with the teaching of moral righteousness, so strongly emphasized throughout the Jewish scriptures, nor with the sublime God-consciousness of the Hebrew prophets, but it seemed to me that the God of the Old Testament and the Talmud was unduly concerned with the ritual by means of which his worshippers were supposed to worship him. It also occurred to me that this God was strangely preoccupied with the destinies of one particular nation, the Hebrews. The very build-up of the Old Testament, as a history of the descendants of Abraham, tended to make God appear not as the creator and sustainer of all mankind, but rather as a tribal deity adjusting all creation to the requirements of a chosen people, rewarding them with conquests if they were righteous, and making them suffer at the hands of non-believers whenever they strayed from the prescribed path. Viewed against these fundamental shortcomings, even the ethical fervor of the later prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, seemed to be barren of a universal message. But although the effect of those early studies of mine was the opposite of what had been intended, leading me away from, rather than closer to, the religion of my forefathers, I often think that in later years they helped me to understand the fundamental purpose of religion, as such, whatever its form. At that time, however, my disappointment with Judaism did not lead me to a search for spiritual truths in other directions. Under the influence of an agnostic environment, I drifted, like so many boys of my age, into a matter-of-fact rejection of all institutional religion. And since my religion had never meant much more to me than a series of restrictive regulations, I felt none the worse for having drifted away from it. Theological and philosophical ideas did not yet really concern me. What I was looking forward to was not much different from the expectations of most other boys. Action, adventure, excitement. Toward the end of 1914, when the Great War was already raging, the first big chance to fulfill my boyish dreams seemed to come within grasp. At the age of 14, I made my escape from school and joined the Austrian army under a false name. I was very tall for my years and easily passed for 18, the minimum age for recruitment, but apparently I did not carry a marshal's baton in my knapsack. After a week or so, my poor father succeeded in tracing me with the help of the police, and I was ignominiously escorted back to Vienna, where my family had settled some time earlier. Nearly 4 years later, I was actually and legitimately drafted into the Austrian army, but by then I had ceased to dream of military glory and was searching for other avenues to self-fulfillment. In any case, a few weeks after my induction, the revolution broke out, the Austrian Empire collapsed, and the war was over. For about 2 years, after the end of the Great War, I studied in a somewhat desultory fashion history of art and philosophy at the University of Vienna. My heart was not in those studies. A quiet academic career did not attract me. I felt a yearning to come into more intimate grips with life, to enter it without any of those carefully contrived artificial defenses which security-minded people love to build up around themselves, and I wanted to find by myself an approach to the spiritual order of things which I knew must exist but which I could not yet discern. It is not easy to explain in so many words what I meant in those days by a spiritual order. It certainly did not occur to me to conceive of the problem in conventional religious terms, or for that matter in any precise terms whatsoever. My vagueness, to be fair to myself, was not of my own making. It was the vagueness of an entire generation. The opening decades of the 20th century stood in the sign of a spiritual vacuum. All the ethical valuations to which Europe have been accustomed for so many centuries had become amorphous under the terrible impact of what had happened between 1914 and 1918, and no new set of values was yet anywhere in sight. A feeling of brittleness and insecurity was in the air, a presentiment of social and intellectual upheavals that made one doubt whether there could ever again be any permanency in man's thoughts and endeavors. Everything seemed to be flowing in a formless flood, and the spiritual restlessness of youth could nowhere find a foothold. In the absence of any reliable standards of morality, nobody could give us young people satisfactory answers to the many questions that perplexed us. Science said, cognition is everything, and forgot that cognition without an ethical goal can only lead to chaos. The social reformers, the revolutionaries, the communists, all of whom undoubtedly wanted to build a better, happier world, were thinking only in terms of outward social and economic circumstances, and to bridge that defect they had raised their materialistic conception of history to a kind of new, anti-metaphysical metaphysics. The traditionally religious people, on the other hand, knew nothing better than to attribute to their God qualities derived from their own habits of thought, which had long since become rigid and meaningless. And when we young people saw that these alleged divine qualities often stood in sharp contrast with what was happening in the world around us, we told ourselves, the moving forces of destiny are evidently different from the qualities which are ascribed to God. Therefore, there is no God. And it occurred to only very few of us that the cause of all this confusion might lie perhaps in the arbitrariness of the self-righteous guardians of faith, who claimed to have the right to define God, and by clothing him with their own garments separated him from man and his destiny. In the individual, this ethical lability could lead either to complete moral chaos and cynicism, or alternatively to a search for a creative personal approach to what might constitute the good life. This instinctive realization may have been indirectly the reason for my choice of history of art as my main subject at the university. It was the true function of art, I suspected, to evoke a vision of the coherent, unifying pattern that must underlie the fragmentary picture of happenings which our consciousness reveals to us, and which, it seemed to me, could only be inadequately formulated through conceptual thought. However, the courses which I attended did not satisfy me. My professors, some of them like Strizgowski and Dvorak, outstanding in their particular fields of study, appeared to be more concerned with discovering the aesthetic laws that govern artistic creation than with bearing its innermost spiritual impulses. In other words, their approach to art was, to my mind, too narrowly confined to the question of the forms in which it expressed itself. The conclusions of psychoanalysis, to which I was introduced in those days of youthful perplexity, left me equally, if for somewhat different reasons, unsatisfied. No doubt, psychoanalysis was at that time an intellectual revolution of the first magnitude, and one felt in one's bones that this flinging open of new, hitherto barred doors of cognition was bound to affect deeply and perhaps change entirely man's thinking about himself and his society. The discovery of the role which unconscious urges play in the formation of the human personality opened, beyond any question, avenues to a more penetrating self-understanding than had been offered to us by the psychological theories of earlier times. All this I was ready to concede. Indeed, the stimulus of Freudian ideas was as intoxicating to my young mind as potent wine, and many were the evenings I spent in Vienna's cafes, listening to exciting discussions between some of the early pioneers of psychoanalysis, such as Alfred Adler, Hermann Steckel, and Otto Grass. But while I certainly did not dispute the validity of its analytical principles, I was disturbed by the intellectual arrogance of the new science, which tried to reduce all mysteries of man's self to a series of neurogenetic reactions. The philosophical conclusions arrived at by its founder and its devotees somehow appeared to me too pat, too cocksure and oversimplified to come anywhere within the neighborhood of ultimate truths, and they certainly did not point any new way to the good life. But although such problems often occupied my mind, they did not really trouble me. I was never given much to metaphysical speculation or to a conscious quest for abstract truths. My interests lay more in the direction of things seen and felt, people, activities, and relationships. And it was just then that I was beginning to discover relationships with women. In the general process of dissolution of established social mores that followed the Great War, many restraints between the sexes had been loosened. What happened was, I think, not so much a revolt against the straight-lacedness of the 19th century as, rather, a passive rebound from a state of affairs in which certain moral standards had been deemed eternal and unquestionable to a social condition in which everything was questionable. A swinging of the pendulum from yesterday's comforting belief in the continuity of man's upward progress to the bitter disillusionment of Spengler, to Nietzsche's moral relativism, and to the spiritual nihilism fostered by psychoanalysis. Looking backward on those early post-war years, I feel that the young men and women who spoke and wrote with so much enthusiasm about the body's freedom were very far indeed from the ebullient spirit of Pan they so often invoked. Their raptures were too self-conscious to be exuberant, and too easygoing to be revolutionary. Their sexual relations had, as a rule, something casual about them, a certain matter-of-fact blandness which often led to promiscuity. Even if I had felt myself bound by the remnants of conventional morality, it would have been extremely difficult to avoid being drawn into a trend that had become so widespread. As it was, I rather gloried, like so many others of my generation, in what was considered a rebellion against the hollow conventions. Flirtations grew easily into affairs, and some of the affairs into passions. I do not think, however, that I was a libertine, for in all of those youthful loves of mine, however flimsy and short-lived, there was always the lilt of a hope, vague but insistent, that the frightful isolation which so obviously separated man from man might be broken by the coalescence of one man and one woman. My restlessness grew and made it increasingly difficult for me to pursue my university studies. At last I decided to give them up for good and to try my hand at journalism. My father, with probably more justification than I was then willing to concede, strongly objected to such a course, maintaining that before I decided to make writing my career, I should at least prove to myself that I could write. And in any case, he concluded, after one of our stormy discussions, a Ph.D. degree has never yet prevented a man from becoming a successful writer. His reasoning was sound, but I was very young, very hopeful, and very restless. When I realized that he would not change his mind, there seemed nothing left but to start a life on my own. Without telling anyone of my intentions, I said goodbye to Vienna one summer day in 1920 and boarded a train for Prague. All I possessed, apart from my personal belongings, was a diamond ring which my mother, who had died a year earlier, had left me. This I sold through the good offices of a waiter in Prague's main literary café. Most probably I was thoroughly gripped in the transaction, but the sum of money which I received appeared like a fortune. With this fortune in my pocket I proceeded to Berlin, where some Viennese friends introduced me to the magic circle of littérateurs and artists at the old Café des Westins. I knew that henceforth I would have to make my way unaided. I would never again expect or accept financial help from my family. Some weeks later, when my father's anger had abated, he wrote to me, "I can already see you ending one day as a tramp on roadside ditch," to which I replied, "No roadside ditch for me. I will come out on top." How I would come out on top was not in the least clear to me, but I knew that I wanted to write, and was of course convinced that the world of letters was waiting for me with arms wide open. After a few months, my cash ran out, and I began to cast about for a job. To a young man with journalistic aspirations, one of the great dailies was the obvious choice, but I found out that I was no choice to them. I did not find it out all at once. It took me weeks of tiresome tramping over the pavements of Berlin, for even a subway or streetcar fare had by then become a problem, and an endless number of humiliating interviews with editors-in-chiefs and news editors and sub-editors to realize that, barring a miracle, a fledgling without a single printed line to his credit had not the slightest chance of being admitted to the sacred precincts of a newspaper. No miracle came my way. Instead, I became acquainted with hunger and spent several weeks subsisting almost entirely on the tea and 2 rolls which my landlady served me in the morning. My literary friends at the Café des Westons could not do much for a raw and inexperienced would-be. Moreover, most of them lived in circumstances not much different from my own, hovering from day to day on the brink of nothingness and struggling hard to keep their chins above water. Sometimes, in the flush of affluence produced by a luckily placed article, or a picture sold, one or another of them would throw a party with beer and frankfurters and would ask me to partake of the sudden bounty, or a rich snob would invite a group of us strange intellectual gypsies to supper in his flat, and would gaze at us with awe while we gorged our empty stomachs with caviar, canapes, and champagne, repaying our host's munificence with clever talk and an insight into bohemian life. But such treats were only exceptions. The rule of my days was stark hunger, and in the nights my sleep was filled with its dreams of steaks and sausages and thick slices of buttered bread. Several times I was tempted to write to my father and beg him for help, which he surely would not have refused, but every time my pride stepped in, and I wrote to him instead of the wonderful job and the good salary I had. At last a lucky break came. I was introduced to F.W. Murnau, who just then was rising to fame as a film director. This was a few years before Hollywood drew him to still greater fame and to an untimely tragic death, and Murnau, with that whimsical impulsiveness which endeared him to all his friends, at once took a fancy to the young man who was looking so eagerly, and with so much hope in the face of adversity, toward the future. He asked me if I would not like to work under him on a new film he was about to begin, and although the job was to be only temporary, I saw the gates of heaven opening before me as I stammered, "Yes, I would." For 2 glorious months, free of all financial worries and entirely absorbed by a host of glittering experiences unlike anything I had ever known, I worked as Murnau's assistant. My self-confidence grew tremendously, and it was certainly not diminished by the fact that the leading lady of the film, a well-known and very beautiful actress, did not prove averse to a flirtation with the director's young assistant. When the film was finished and Murnau had to go abroad for a new assignment, I took leave of him with the conviction that my worst days were over. Shortly afterward, my good friend Anton Kuh, a Viennese journalist who had recently come to prominence in Berlin as a theater critic, invited me to collaborate with him on a film scenario which he had been commissioned to write. I accepted the idea with enthusiasm and put, I believe, much work into the script. At any rate, the producer who had commissioned it gladly paid the sum agreed upon, which Anton and I divided 50-50. In order to celebrate our entry into the world of films, we gave a party in one of the most fashionable restaurants in Berlin, and when we received the bill, we found that practically our entire earnings had gone up in lobster, caviar, and French wines. But our luck held out. We immediately sat down to writing another scenario, a fantasy woven around the figure of Balzac, and a bizarre, entirely imaginary experience of his, and found a buyer on the very day it was completed. This time, however, I refused to celebrate our success, and went instead on several weeks' holiday to the Bavarian lakes. After another year full of adventurous ups and downs in various cities of Central Europe, involving all manner of short-lived jobs, I succeeded at last in breaking into the world of journalism. This breakthrough took place in the autumn of 1921, after another period of financial low. One afternoon, while I was sitting in the Café des Westons, tired and disconsolate, a friend of mine sat down at my table. When I recounted my troubles to him, he suggested, "There might be a chance for you. Dammert is starting a news agency of his own in cooperation with the United Press of America. It will be called the United Telegraph. I am sure that he will need a large number of sub-editors. I'll introduce you to him if you like." Dr. Dammert was a well-known figure in the political circles of Berlin in the 20s, prominent in the ranks of the Catholic Center Party. A wealthy man in his own right, he enjoyed an excellent reputation, and the idea of working under him appealed to me. Next day, my friend took me to Dr. Dammer's office. The elegant middle-aged man was suave and friendly as he invited us to be seated. "Mr. Fingal," that was my friend's name, "has spoken to me about you. Have you ever worked before as a journalist?" "No, sir," I replied, "but I have had plenty of other experience. I am something of an expert on Eastern European countries, and know several of the languages. In fact, the only Eastern European language I could speak was Polish, and I had only the vaguest idea of what was going on in that part of the world, but I was resolved not to let my chance be spoiled by undue modesty. "Oh, that is interesting," remarked Dr. Dammert with half a smile. "I have a penchant for experts, but unfortunately I can't use an expert on Eastern European affairs just now." He must have seen the disappointment on my face, for he quickly continued, "Still, I may have an opening for you, although it may be somewhat beneath your standing, I wonder." "What is the opening, sir?" I inquired eagerly, thinking of my unpaid rent. "Well, I need several more telephonists." "Oh, no, no, don't worry, not at a switchboard. I mean telephonists to transmit news to the provincial newspapers." This was indeed a come-down from my high expectations. I looked at Dr. Dammert, and he looked at me, and when I saw the tightening of the humorous creases around his eyes, I knew that my boastful game was up. "I accept, sir," I answered, with a sigh and a laugh. The following week I started my new job. It was a boring job, and a far cry from the journalistic career I had been dreaming of. I had nothing to do but transmit by telephone, several times daily, news from a mimeographed sheet to the many provincial newspapers that subscribed to the service. But I was a good telephonist, and the pay was good, too. This went on for about a month. At the end of the month, an unforeseen opportunity offered itself to me. In that year of 1921, Soviet Russia was stricken by a famine of unprecedented dimensions. Millions of people were starving and hundreds of thousands dying. The entire European press was buzzing with gruesome descriptions of the situation. Several foreign relief operations were being planned, among them one by Herbert Hoover, who had done so much for Central Europe after the Great War. A large-scale action within Russia was headed by Maxim Gorki. His dramatic appeals for aid were stirring the entire world, and it was rumored that his wife would shortly visit the capitals of Central and Western Europe in an attempt to mobilize public opinion for more effective help. Being only a telephonist, I did not participate directly in the coverage of this sensational episode until a chance remark from one of my chance acquaintances, I had many of them in the strangest places, suddenly drew me into its midst. The acquaintance was the night doorman at the Hotel Esplanade, one of Berlin's swankiest, and the remark had been, "This Madame Gorki is a very pleasant lady. One would never guess that she is a Bolshie." "Madame Gorki? Where the hell did you see her?" My informant lowered his voice to a whisper. "She is staying at our hotel. Came yesterday, but is registered under an assumed name. Only the manager knows who she really is. She doesn't want to be pestered by reporters." "And how do you know it?" "We doormen know everything that goes on in the hotel," he replied with a grin. "Do you think we could keep our jobs for long if we didn't?" What a story it would make to get an exclusive interview with Madame Gorki, the more so as not a word of her presence in Berlin had so far penetrated to the press. I was all at once on fire. "Could you," I asked my friend, "somehow make it possible for me to see her?" "Well, I don't know. She is obviously dead set on keeping herself to herself, but I could do one thing. If you sit in the lobby in the evening, I might be able to point her out to you." That was a deal. I rushed back to my office at the United Telegraph. Almost everyone had gone home by that time, but fortunately the news editor was still at his desk. I buttonholed him. "Will you give me a press card if I promise to bring back a sensational story?" "What kind of a story?" he inquired suspiciously. "You give me the press card, and I'll give you the story. If I don't, you can always have the card back." Finally the old newshound agreed, and I emerged from the office the proud possessor of a card which designated me as a representative of the United Telegraph. The next few hours were spent in the lobby of the Esplanade. At 9 o'clock my friend arrived on duty. From the doorway he winked at me, disappeared behind the reception desk, and reappeared a few minutes later with the information that Madame Gorki was out. "If you sit here long enough, you're sure to see her when she returns." At about 11 o'clock I caught my friend's signal. He was pointing surreptitiously to a lady who had just entered the revolving door. A small, delicate woman in her middle 40s, dressed in an extremely well-cut black gown, with a long black silk cape trailing on the ground behind her. She was so genuinely aristocratic in her bearing that it was indeed difficult to imagine her as the wife of the working man's poet, and still more difficult as a citizen of the Soviet Union. Blocking her way, I bowed and proceeded to address her in my most engaging tones. "Madame Gorki." For an instant she appeared startled, but then a soft smile lighted her beautiful black eyes, and she answered in a German that bore only a faint trace of Slav accent. "I am not Madame Gorki. You are mistaken. My name is so-and-so," giving a Russian-sounding name which I have forgotten. "No, Madame Gorki," I persisted. "I know that I am not mistaken. But I also know that you do not want to be bothered by us reporters. But it would mean a great deal, a very great deal to me, to be allowed to speak to you for a few minutes. This is my first chance to establish myself. I am sure you would not like to destroy that chance." I showed her my press card. "I got it only today, and I will have to return it unless I produce the story of my interview with Madame Gorki." The aristocratic lady continued to smile. "And if I were to tell you on my word of honor that I am not Madame Gorki, would you believe me then? If you were to tell me anything on your word of honor, I would believe it." She burst out laughing. "You seem to be a nice little boy." Her graceful head reached hardly to my shoulder. "I am not going to tell you any more lies. You win. But we can't spend the rest of the evening here in the lobby. Would you give me the pleasure of having tea with me in my rooms?" And so I had the pleasure of having tea with Madame Gorki in her rooms. For nearly an hour she vividly described the horrors of the famine, and when I left her after midnight I had a thick sheaf of notes with me. The sub-editors on night duty at the United Telegraph opened their eyes wide on seeing me at that unusual hour. But I did not bother to explain, for I had urgent work to do. Writing down my interview as quickly as I could, I booked, without waiting for editorial clearance, urgent press calls to all the newspapers we served. Next morning the bomb burst. While none of the great Berlin dailies had a single word about Madame Gorki's presence in town, all the provincial papers served by our agency carried on their front pages the United Telegraph special representative's exclusive interview with Madame Gorki. The telephonist had made a first-class scoop. In the afternoon, a conference of editors took place in Dr. Damer's office. I was called in, and after a preliminary lecture in which it was explained to me that no news item of importance ought ever to go out without first being cleared by the news editor, I was informed that I had been promoted to reporter. At last I was a journalist.